Welcome to the Mysteries Abound podcast, everyone. This is your host, Paul, and this is episode 95. This episode's entitled, What Lies Beneath Stonehenge? But first up, an article by Arika Ockrent from the mentalfloss.com website. The Wisconsin town that didn't learn English for 5 generations. In 1837, an Irishman from New York named John Hustis bought a plot of land 50 miles north of Madison, Wisconsin, and founded the town of Hustisford. For a few years the town spoke English, the language of the Irish and English families who got there first. Then came the Germans. Between 1840 and 1880, millions of German-speaking immigrants settled in the United States. Many of them came to Wisconsin. The German families who came to Hustisford set up German-speaking schools, churches, clubs and shops. Soon, nearly every aspect of Hustisford was conducted in German. Even the Irish were learning it. So far, the story of Hustisford looks very much like the story people usually tell about their immigrant ancestors. The great-grandparents came from the old country, bringing their language and customs with them. However, the story then usually continues with those immigrants working hard to assimilate, gradually learning English and adapting to their new circumstances. It ends with their children casting off the old language for good, and voila, the melting into the pot is complete. But that's not the way it happened in Hustisford. Around 2007, when University of Wisconsin linguists Miranda Wilkinson and Joseph Sammons began looking at historical language data in East Wisconsin, they found something unexpected. The 1910 census numbers revealed that not only was German still widely spoken in the region at that time, a half-century after German immigration had tapered off, but many of those German speakers could not speak English. In 1910, a quarter of the population in Hustisford were still monolingual German speakers. This was not because they had recently arrived. Almost 60% of them had immigrated before 1880. A third of them had been born in the US. More surprisingly, a number of those had been born in the US to US-born parents. In other words, they were the grandchildren of immigrants, third generation, who had still not learned English. Even the ones who claimed to speak English could not necessarily speak it all that well. Court records from that time show cases where people who'd claimed English on the census form could not respond in English to simple questions from a judge. Despite occasionally running into difficulty at the courthouse, for the most part, the lack of English didn't get in the way of a happy, successful life for the German speakers of Hustisford. Non-English speaking citizens were baptised, confirmed, educated and married in German. They worked as blacksmiths, tailors and merchants. They built their homes, farmed their land and saved up for the benefit of future generations who did, eventually, learn English. A wave of anti-German sentiment during World War I helped speed the decline of the German language in some parts of the US, but did not kill it off completely. German was still a big part of daily life in Hustisford and other eastern Wisconsin towns, at least until the 1930s. For example, records show that a church in the nearby town of Lebanon decided to introduce one English language sermon a month on a trial basis in 1929. It took almost 100 years and nearly 5 generations for Hustisford to become a purely English-speaking town. Wilkinson and Sammons point to the story of Hustisford and the region around it as a refutation of the commonly made claim that immigrants today just don't learn English like they used to. In fact, according to a recent report by the Migration Policy Institute, today's immigrants are learning English faster than ever. They're certainly learning it faster than they did in Hustisford. August 15, 2014 marked the 70th anniversary of Operation Dragoon, an Allied invasion of southern France initially intended to launch in tandem with the invasion of Normandy Beach on D-Day. Between 1943 and 1945, Nazi Germany built a vast system of defensive battlements along the Atlantic coast, stretching from northern Norway to the Pyrenees, in a massive effort to defend occupied European territories against invasion. In the decades that have passed since this wall first emerged, many of these imposing fortresses remain nestled among the European coastline as architectural relics. Photographer Stefan van Vletteren travelled the length of the Atlantic Wall, capturing the stark and strange beauty of these often colossal remnants of World War II in the photo book Atlantic Wall. From the lightbox.time.com website, an article by Stefan van Vletteren, The Ghostly Remains of Nazi Germany's Atlantic Wall. And there is a 17-photograph slideshow to go with this article. Definitely worth a look. Quite eerie, quite strange, quite beautiful in its own way. As one European country after another succumbed to the relentless onslaught of Hitler's Wehrmacht, sweeping across the continent in the early 1940s, and German armies stood peering across the water on the Atlantic coast, military planning to fortify the new borders of the Nazi Empire were in full flow. Having built a 630-kilometre-long defensive barrier along its borders with France, Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg in the 1930s, German planners took the strategic building project to a whole new level after the British victory in the Battle of Britain, and started to work on a comprehensive system of bunkers, fortifications and obstacles, with the primary objective of thwarting an Allied invasion. Starting in the far northern reaches of what was then Finland, now Russia, and covering the most exposed coastal areas of Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium and France down to the Pyrenees, concrete bunkers and fortified artillery batteries were later supplemented with minefields and obstacles strewn across the beaches. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who was tasked with overseeing the wall in early 1944, also had obstacles and mines planted at sea that would be invisible at high tide, the most likely time for a seaborne invasion. What is remarkable about the Nazi attempt to batten down the hatches around a new German empire on European soil was the sheer extent and the efficiency with which it was achieved in just over 3 years. Using a mixture of German civilian and military workers and tens of thousands of POWs and other slave labour, the different types of embattlements followed a set of standard blueprints that were implemented across the board. Since the end of the war, many of the thousands of structures have been dismantled or left to slip into the sea. In Germany, among the rebuilding frenzy of the late 40s and 50s, almost all the concrete fortifications were eradicated. In France, where civilian workers were employed to build many of the structures, the historical significance of the Atlantic Wall as a historical monument remains controversial. And remember, if you'd like to have a look, visit the show notes at www.origins.info, click on the link at the Mysteries Abound show notes to episode 95, and then the link to this article. It's definitely worth a look. From the www.odditycentral.com website, a story by Sumitra. Cambodia's miracle performing baby draws thousands of sick pilgrims. Kong Keng, a 2-year-old kid from Kanor village in Cambodia, is being hailed as a miracle baby with special healing powers. Thousands of people are travelling from as far as Laos and Vietnam, believing that even a glimpse of Kong will help cure them of their ailments. He appears to be the last ray of hope in a nation that doesn't exactly have the world's best healthcare system. Hundreds of people throng outside Kong's single-room wooden home every single day. It's a motley crowd of handicapped people in wheelchairs and ailing, dying patients on stretchers. Fatson, Kong's 21-year-old mother, brings the boy out and places a row of eucalyptus balm bottles in front of him. She then guides his hand over each bottle. His touch is believed to transfer healing powers to the balm. The toddler's healing powers were discovered by an accidental healing miracle that occurred a few months ago. "The miracle happened to my brother," said Sung Ban, Kong's uncle. "He was paralysed from the waist down after a motorcycle accident. Doctors couldn't cure him, and neither could the Kru Khmers, or the traditional Cambodian healers. He went to visit his nephew, and the boy asked him, 'What's the matter?' The man told him that he couldn't walk, so the boy found some leaves to make into a tea for the old man to drink. He drank the tea, got up and began walking perfectly." Naturally, such a miraculous event couldn't remain a secret for long. The whole village was buzzing about it, and within 2 weeks the story was covered by national newspapers and TV channels. 20,000 people have come here in the last month hoping to be cured, said village chief Suhen. Over 1,000 people have received effective treatment from the magic boy so far. I have seen people who were dumb speak, and others who were paralysed get up and walk. Kong is now practically royalty in the sleepy little village of Knorr. The entire community helps in managing the boy's visitors. Loudspeakers crackle with regular updates like, "The magic boy is sleeping, so please keep quiet so he doesn't get angry." Or, "The boy is with his mother collecting magic herbs and will return in 2 hours. These leaves identified by Kong for their healing properties, after which they are distributed among the ailing people. The magic boy's clientele is quite varied. Even the district collector made an appearance to get some of the magic leaves for his sick children. "Most people have to wait, but he got some right away because he is the governor," said Hyun Tak, the governor's companion. "Unfortunately, not everyone is that lucky. Some people have been waiting for as long as 9 days for a cure." Naturally, the more scientifically inclined people in Cambodia are trashing the idea of the magic boy. But it's easy to see why the boy has become so popular across the nation. "Cambodian religion believes that spirits can possess people," said Dr. Jonathan H.X. Lee, Assistant Professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University. "Illness is experienced as being possessed by a spirit, and that's why therapy would require some kind of religious ritual." And that's exactly what Kong's pilgrims believe, that the boy acts as a medium for an elemental spirit with healing powers. "I don't know why my boy is magic, he just is," said his father, Ban Kong, 25. The child cured his uncle. The news spread, and now thousands have come. "We give the magic leaves away for free, but to get on the waiting list, people have to donate $1 to local Buddhist temples. Supplies are limited, and sometimes they have to wait a few days. The leaves might be free of cost, but a meeting with the Kong himself isn't. If they want to see the boy personally, we charge them $2 or $3, said Ban. That might not sound like much, but it actually is a big deal in a nation where the average wage is $3 a day. Ban, who is a rice farmer, earns around $1,000 a year, but his son's healing powers have earned him $2,500 in the past month alone. Some people say we are lying to get money, but that is their belief, not mine, he said. And if you'd like to learn a little bit more, just visit the show notes, click on the link to this article. There are a few photographs of the Miracle Boy and a short video to go with it. On May 18, 1926, Amy Semple McPherson went for a swim in the Pacific Ocean at Venice Beach. An avid swimmer, Amy loved to escape from her temple in Echo Park for a quick dip in the ocean. She was dropped off by her secretary, who then left to do errands. When the secretary returned, Macpherson wasn't on the beach, or in the water, or anywhere. In a panic, the secretary called for the leaders of the Angelus Temple. After searching, they concluded the only logical thing. The leader of the Four-Square Gospel and the popular revolutionary evangelist, Aimee Semple McPherson, had drowned in the Pacific Ocean. As Amy's mother put it to a teary-eyed congregation at the Angelus Temple later that evening, "Sister Amy is with Jesus." But that wasn't the end of the tale of the mysterious disappearance of Aimee Semple McPherson. It was just the beginning. From the www.todayifoundout.com website, an article written by Matt Blitz. The mysterious disappearance of Sister Aimee Semple McPherson. McPherson, who would grow up to be more famous than the President of the United States, came from relatively humble origins. She was born on October 9, 1890, as Amy Elizabeth Kennedy in Ontario, Canada, to a religious family. Her father James was a farmer. Her mother, known as Minnie, worked for the Salvation Army. She was a good student and naturally inquisitive, especially when it came to theories of evolution. In high school, a teacher of hers told her that the world was a product of centuries of evolutionary development. She immediately questioned this, to the end that she wrote a Canadian national newspaper asking why public schools would employ teachers that would undermine Christianity. That letter ended up circulating across the country, giving her an early brush with fame and public exposure. Her parents were proud of her deeply religious behaviour, but wondered about her flair for the dramatic. She began attending Pentecostal revivalist services and fell in love with its fiery Irish preacher, Robert Semple. They married in 1908. As a revivalist, Robert Semple's job was to travel the world and spread the word of God. When he married Amy, he began taking her with him. They first moved to Chicago, then in 1910 to China. Tragedy struck quickly after they arrived, when Robert contracted malaria and died. A month later, Amy had her and Robert's only child, Roberta Starr, named in part after her beloved deceased husband. She returned to North America with her young daughter, joined up with her mother Minnie, and worked at the Salvation Army in New York City. In 1912, she met a well-off accountant, Harold McPherson, and they married soon after. A year later, they had a son, Rolf, but Amy had no intention of settling down as a housewife. She felt she was meant to preach. She began touring the Northeast, then all over the US and Canada. With her 2 kids, a large tent on top of the car, and "Jesus is coming soon, get ready" painted on the side, she quickly became a hit, holding tent revivals and preaching in churches to thousands. Always known for her flair for the dramatic, she spoke in tongues and claimed she could faith heal. Her mother joined her at many of these speaking engagements. Unfortunately, her husband Harold did not. He filed for divorce, citing abandonment as the reason. Amy's fame grew quickly. As an energetic, dramatic, over-the-top female evangelistic, she was very much a breath of fresh air in the 1920 religious landscape. By 1922, according to Smithsonian Magazine, she was breaking attendance records set by her male peers. In San Diego, over 300,000 people came to see her do her thing. There were so many people that the Marines were called in as crowd control. At that same event, it was said that Amy laid her hands on a paralysed woman and she walked, supposedly for the first time. Aimee Semple McPherson was a star. In 1921, she made her way to the city that would be perfect for her theatrical-based religious ceremonies, Los Angeles. Using the money she had earned from her appearances, she bought land in Echo Park and began building the Angelus Temple for her Four-Square Gospel, named so for the 4 tenets of Jesus: Jesus Christ as the Saviour, the Holy Spirit, the Healer, and the soon-coming King. It opened in 1923 and sat 5,300 people, but attracted thousands more. It was, as the National Architecture online magazine Curbed called it, America's first megachurch. Her sermons were a sight to behold. She employed artists, set designers and actors to help her construct her illustrated sermons. She knew how to hold a person's attention, and that was with a show. Harper's Magazine in 1927 reported that, "In this show-devouring city, no entertainment compares in popularity with that of Angelus Temple." She even took it a step further, utilising the new technology of the time. On February 26, 1924, she purchased a Los Angeles radio station, KFSG, becoming the second woman ever to be granted a broadcasting licence. She used KFSG to broadcast her sermons across the region so that her followers, who couldn't get to the Angelus Temple, could still hear the Word of God. By May 1926, Macpherson was at the height of her fame, which made her sudden vanishing so shocking. In the days that followed Amy's disappearance, supporters, followers and searchers flocked to the beach to see what, if anything, they could find. 2 particularly devoted individuals drowned while searching for Amy in the water. Some of her followers even set off dynamite in the water, thinking that could potentially raise her body from the depths. Instead, they got a whole bunch of dead fish. Others thought it was just a matter of time before Amy came back, rising from the dead like Jesus. As time dragged on and no body was found, the press began to speculate that she wasn't dead at all, but simply gone. Her boisterous personality and lifestyle led to stories that she was hiding due to plastic surgery or having an abortion or an affair. In fact, the recent departure of Kenneth G. Ormiston, an engineer at KFSG, and interviews done by his ex-wife fueled the rumours that Macpherson had in fact left with Ormiston. Sister Amy sightings came from across the country, from San Francisco to Virginia. One private detective swore he saw her getting on a train near San Fran. "I know her well by sight, and I know that I am not mistaken." Minnie, Amy's mother, received ransom notes from several different groups saying that they had Macpherson and wanted money. One, signed by a group called the Avengers, demanded an outrageous sum of $500,000, about $6.7 million today. Minnie, thinking they were all fake, threw the notes out. 32 days after Amy Semple Macpherson disappeared, she was found in the small Mexican town of Agua Prieta, Sonora, just south of Douglas, Arizona, and 600 miles from Los Angeles. Ending up at a hospital, she told the staff she had been kidnapped, drugged and held hostage in a tiny shack. Only after undoing the ropes that restrained her and walking 20 miles in the barren desert did she escape. Exhausted and dishevelled, but otherwise healthy, it was a miracle. Or was it? After confirming her identity by locating a tiny scar on her finger and Amy's ability to name her pet pigeon, leaders of the temple and Minnie made their way to Arizona. Amy completed the story for everyone. She had been on the beach when she was approached by a man and woman, supposedly named Steve and Mexicala Rose, who said their daughter was very ill and they needed Amy to pray for her. She agreed and went in their car with them. She was drugged and taken to a shack in the Mexican desert. They weren't going to let her go until they got the $500,000 they had demanded in the note they had sent to Minnie. She returned home to Los Angeles with a throng of over 50,000 waiting for her at the Angelus Temple. While everyone was thrilled to have her back, not everyone believed her story, including Los Angeles District Attorney Asa Keys. Several clues and pieces of evidence just didn't add up. She was in too good a health for being held for 32 days and walking 20 miles. Her clothes were too clean and her shoes showed nothing but grass stains. In addition, there was the whole business of Ormiston, whose ex-wife kept insisting he was having an affair with Macpherson. Within 2 weeks, Macpherson appeared voluntarily in front of a grand jury. She reiterated her story. Still not convinced, Keys sent police officers to Ormiston's cottage in Northern California to check for fingerprints of Macpherson. While Ormiston did admit that he was having affairs in the cable, none were with Macpherson. Despite all of this, the grand jury determined there was enough evidence to charge Amy Semple McPherson with conspiracy and obstruction of justice. The case was scheduled for January 1927. In November of 1926, Keyes dropped the charges. The unreliability of witnesses made the chances of winning unlikely. No one was ever charged or arrested for her kidnapping. To this day, no one knows for sure if she actually ever was. Amy Semple McPherson, despite the spectre of a fake kidnapping hanging over her, continued to preach. Her congregation grew. It was said she was more well known at the time than the President of the United States, Calvin Coolidge. Her constant travels, showmanship, and inability to keep herself healthy paid its toll, though. On September 23, 1944, Amy Semple McPherson was found dead in Oakland, California, hours before she was supposed to speak in front of thousands. The official cause of death, according to the coroner, was a likely accidental overdose of sleeping medication, compounded by kidney failure. The Angelus Temple is still in Echo Park today, and the Four-Square Gospel is thriving. If you care to pay them a visit, there is a museum dedicated to Sister Amy, and they are happy to answer any questions one may have, including any about the alleged kidnapping. One day in 1922, near Broken Hill, southern Rhodesia, or now Zimbabwe, a skull was found. When it came to the attention of the British Museum, the curators were pleased. From the www.shieldsgazette.com website. Was Neanderthal shot by a time traveller? It was in fact a Neanderthal skull, and Neanderthal bones did not exactly come 10 a penny. But the Broken Hill skull was special for other reasons. On the left side of the cranium was a small, perfectly round hole. At first it was assumed that it had been made by a spear or other sharp implement, but further investigation proved that this had not been the case. When a skull is struck by a relatively low-velocity projectile, such as an arrow or spear, it produces what are known as radial cracks or striations, that is, minute hairline fractures running away from the place of impact. As there were no radial fractures on the Neanderthal skull, it was unanimously concluded that the projectile must have had a far, far greater velocity than an arrow or spear. But what? Another mystery was that the right side of the cranium had, in the words of one anthropologist, been blown away. Further research also proved that the right side of the cranium had been blown away from the inside out. In short, whatever had hit the Broken Hill Neanderthal on the left side of the head had passed through it with such force that it had caused the right side to explode. Researcher René Nuybergen investigated the mystery in his excellent book Secrets of the Lost Races and commented, "This same feature is seen in modern victims of head wounds received from shots from a high-powered rifle." Nuybergen's comments were more than appropriate, for forensic experts who have studied the skull in Berlin have since concluded that the cranial damage to Rhodesian man's skull could not have been caused by anything but a bullet. Compounding the mystery further is the fact that the skull of an ancient auroch, an extinct type of bison, was found in Russia by the Lena River. It too had been shot in the head thousands of years previously, but had survived for some time as the bullet hole had calcified. This sensational discovery came to the attention of Professor Konstantin Flerov, curator of Moscow's Paleontological Museum of the USSR, who promptly put the skull on display. Incredible though it sounds, we are faced with the quite forceful evidence that thousands of years ago someone discharged a bullet into the skull of one of our anthropological cousins and also nearly killed a large mammal by the same method. But how could this be? One obvious but very radical solution is to conclude that, contrary to what we have always understood, ancient man may have been technologically developed to a very high degree. Did a small but advanced civilization develop the concept of ballistics long before the Chinese? The problem with this idea is that it is too much of a coincidence. Could two separate societies, separated by thousands of years and a vast cultural gulf, have both invented weapons that just happen to fire a small cylindrical projectile at high speed? One colleague suggested to me that the only alternative is the possibility that someone from the future, carrying a firearm, travelled back into the past and engaged in some sort of trans-temporal hunting expedition. This takes us perilously close to the realms of science fantasy, of course, but the fact is that the hole in the aurochs skull got there somehow. Like it or not, the fact is that someone or something seemed to be using high-velocity bullets thousands of years ago. We don't know who, we don't know why, and we don't know how. But it happened. From the www.smithsonianmag.com website, an article written by Ed Caesar. What lies beneath Stonehenge? A groundbreaking survey of the site has turned up tantalising new clues to what really went on there. We walked the avenue, the ancient route along which the stones were first dragged from the River Avon. For centuries this was the formal path to the Great Henge, but now the only hint of its existence was an indentation or two in the tall grass. It was a fine English summer's day, with thin, fast clouds above, and as we passed through the fields dotted with buttercups and daisies, cows and sheep, we could have been hikers anywhere, were it not for the ghostly monument in the near distance. Faint as the avenue was, Vince Gaffney hustled along as if it were illuminated by runway lights. A short, sprightly archaeologist of 56 from Newcastle upon Tyne in northeast England, he knows this landscape as well as anyone alive. He's walked it, breathed it, studied it for uncounted hours. He has not lost his sense of wonder. Stopping to fix the monument in his eyeline and reaching out towards the stones on the horizon, he said, "Look, it becomes cathedral-esque." Gaffney's latest research effort, the Stonehenge Hidden Landscapes Project, is a 4-year collaboration between a British team and Ludwig Boltzmann Institute for Archaeological Prospection and Virtual Archaeology in Austria that has produced the first detailed underground survey of the area surrounding Stonehenge, totalling more than 4 square miles. The results are astonishing. The researchers have found buried evidence of more than 15 previously unknown or poorly understood late Neolithic monuments, henges, barrows, segmented ditches, pits. To Gaffney, these findings suggest a scale of activity around Stonehenge far beyond what was previously suspected. There was sort of this idea that Stonehenge sat in the middle and around it was effectively an area where people were probably excluded, Gaffney told me. A ring of the dead around a special area to which few people might ever have been admitted. Perhaps there were priests, big men, whatever they were, inside Stonehenge having processions up the avenue, doing something extremely mysterious. Of course, that sort of analysis depends on not knowing what's actually in the area around Stonehenge itself. It was terra incognita, really. Nobody has yet put a spade in the ground to verify the new findings, which were painstakingly gathered by geophysicists and others wielding magnetometers and ground-penetrating radars that scan the ground to detect structures and objects several yards below the surface. But Gaffney has no doubt of the work's value. This is among the most important landscapes, and probably the most studied landscape in the world, he says, and the area has been absolutely transformed by this survey. Won't be the same again. The joy and frustrations of all archaeological study, perhaps all historical inquiry, come into particularly sharp relief at Stonehenge. Even to the most casual observer, the monument is deeply significant. Those vast stones standing in concentric rings in the middle of a basin on Salisbury Plain, carefully placed by who knows who thousands of years ago, must mean something. But nobody can tell us what. Not exactly. The clues that remain will always prove insufficient to our curiosity. Each archaeological advance yields more questions and more theories to be tested. Our ignorance shrinks by fractions. What we know is always dwarfed by what we can never know. Take the big question. Was Stonehenge predominantly a temple, a parliament, or a graveyard? Was it a healing ground? We don't know for sure. We know that people were buried there, and that the stones are aligned in astronomically important ways. We also understand, because of the chemical composition of animal bones found nearby, and the provenance of the stones, that people travelled hundreds of miles to visit Stonehenge. But we cannot say with certainty why. Try a simpler question. How did the blue stones, which weigh between 4 and 8 tons apiece, arrive at the site nearly 5,000 years ago from 170 miles away in North Wales? Land or sea? Both alternatives explode with possibilities, and nobody has an impregnable theory. Mike Parker Pearson of University College London is working on a new idea, that the blue stones might have been lifted onto huge wooden lattices and carried by dozens of men to the site. But it's just a theory. We can't know definitively. We can only have better informed questions. The ineffability of Stonehenge has not dulled our appetite. The site has long proved irresistible to diggers. In 1620, the Duke of Buckingham and his men excavated right in the centre of the monument. Although they did not know it at the time, they dug on the site of a prehistoric pit. Buckingham's men found skulls of cattle and other beasts, and large quantities of burnt coals or charcoals. But no treasure, as they had hoped. In the 19th century, barrow digging, or the excavation of prehistoric monuments and burial hills, was a popular pastime among the landed gentry. In 1839, a naval officer named Captain Beamish dug out an estimated 400 cubic feet of soil from the northeast of the altar at Stonehenge. As Parker Pearson notes in his book Stonehenge, Beamish's hole was probably the final blow for any prehistoric features that once lay at Stonehenge's centre. Work at Stonehenge became less invasive. In 1952, Willard Libby, the American chemist and later a Nobel Prize winner, used his new radiocarbon dating technique on a piece of charcoal from a pit within Stonehenge to date the monument to 1848 BC, give or take 275 years. That date has since been refined several times. The prevailing opinion is that the first stones were erected on the site around 2600 BC. Although the building of Stonehenge was carried out over a millennium, and there were centuries of ritual activity at the site before the stones were in place. In 2003, Parker Pearson conducted his own survey, concentrating on the nearby settlement at Durrington Walls and the area between there and the River Avon. Based on huts, tools and animal bones he uncovered, he concluded that Durrington Walls likely housed the workers who built Stonehenge. Based on an analysis of human remains he later excavated from Stonehenge, he also surmised that, far from being a site of quotidian religious activity, Stonehenge served as a cemetery, a place for the dead. The Stonehenge Hidden Landscapes project is different from everything that came before it. When Gaffney and his team started their work, they were less interested in theories than in data. To that end, they concentrated on taking what amounts to a 3-dimensional and yards-deep photograph of the entire landscape. The perceived wisdom was driven by the monuments we knew about, says Gaffney. We've put in the data between the monuments. Chris Gaffney, Vince's younger, slighter and less voluble brother, was one of the instigators of this new approach. The duo's grandfather was a metalwork teacher from Newcastle with an interest in archaeology, who took his clever grandchildren on trips to Hadrian's Wall, the old barrier between the Roman Empire and the blasted north. Small wonder that Vince became an archaeologist and Chris a geophysicist, now at the University of Bradford. The Gaffney brothers' interest in new technologies that were becoming available to archaeologists led them to the first GPS-guided magnetometer systems. A magnetometer has sensors that allow a geophysicist to see evidence of historic building and even ancient ditch digging beneath the soil by mapping variations in the Earth's magnetic field. The GPS-guided versions were able to pinpoint some of those discoveries to within 1 centimetre. The Gaffneys believed that Stonehenge scholarship needed a massive magnetometer and radar-led survey of the whole site. We just didn't know if anything's there, Vince Gaffney recalled. So we're constructing various hypotheses on the basis of something we don't know. Around the same time, an Austrian archaeologist named Wolfgang Neubayer, now of the Boltzmann Institute, was hoping to conduct large-scale projects all over Europe using tools including GPS magnetometers and ground-penetrating radar. Neubayer's team had also developed software to process the 40 or 50 gigabytes of raw data that these instruments could create in a day. Suddenly, instead of waiting weeks or months to see what the machines had found, it was possible to cover several acres with magnetometers and radar in a day and to display that information on a screen almost instantaneously. One of the areas Neubayer wanted to scan was Stonehenge, and in the spring of 2009 he contacted Vince Gaffney. A few months later, the Boltzmann Institute and the University of Birmingham, plus several other British and European universities, museums and companies that contributed expertise and resources, began their collaboration at Stonehenge. Their first days on sites, Gaffney recalled, were like a geophysical circus had come to town. Tractors pushed the ground-penetrating radars, which looked like high-powered lawnmowers. All-terrain vehicles dragged the magnetometer sensors on long strings. Delicate instruments covering hard, uneven ground kept mechanics and technicians busy. I have seen one of our magnetometers shear clear apart in front of me, said Gaffney. It was back in service the next day. In all, the fieldwork took about 120 days, spread over 4 years. In a multimedia room at the University of Birmingham, there was a vast touch screen, 6 feet by 9, on which a new map of the Stonehenge landscape appeared. Gaffney pointed out the key features. There was Stonehenge itself, marked by the familiar circles. To the north was the long, thin strip called the Stonehenge Cursus, or the Great Cursus, which was demarcated by ditches, and ran east to west for nearly 2 miles. The Cursus was given its name by the antiquarian William Stukely in the 18th century because it looked like an ancient Roman racecourse. Its construction predates the first building work at Stonehenge by several hundred years. Gaffney also pointed out the Cursus Barrows, hillocks containing mass human graves, just south of the Cursus itself, and the King Barrow Ridge to the east. Scattered all over the map were blotches of black, features without names. These were new finds, including the more than 15 possible new or poorly understood Neolithic monuments. Gaffney emphasised possible, acknowledging that it will require digging, the testimony of the spade, to discover precisely what was there. Standing in front of this constellation of evidence, he seemed unable to decide where to start, like a child at the Christmas tree. These are little henge monuments, he said, touching the screen to highlight a group of black smudges. Nice little entrance there, and a ditch. These things we know nothing about. He saved his greatest enthusiasm for the discoveries that had been made in the Cursus. This feature, said Gaffney, had always been thought of as a bloody Great Barrier to the north of Stonehenge. nobody knew quite what it was for. Because the cursus runs east to west, archaeologists have always believed that its presence owes something to the passage of the sun. The monument must be significant. It was dug in the 4th millennium BC using antler picks. Hundreds of thousands of man-hours went into its construction. The Hidden Landscapes Project's instruments discovered several new clues. First of all, they found gaps in the ditch, in particular a very large break in the northern side to allow people to enter and exit the cursus. Now, instead of seeing the cursus exclusively as a monument that encouraged movement along the path of the sun east to west, Gaffney began to consider these gaps as channels through the landscape to guide the movement of people north to south. A bigger discovery, Gaffney says, was a bloody huge pit about 5 yards in diameter at the eastern end of the cursus. Today it lies buried at least 3 feet below the surface of the ground. Such a pit was much too large for a practical use, for instance burying trash, because of the labour involved in digging it. In the archaeologists' minds, it could only have ritual implications, as a marker of some kind, Gaffney said. What's more, if you drew a straight line between the pit and the heelstone at Stonehenge, it ran directly along the final section of the avenue, on the path of the sunrise on the summer solstice. We thought, that's a bit of a coincidence, Gaffney recalled. That was the point at which he thought, what's at the other end? And there's another pit. 2 pits marking the midsummer sunrise and the midsummer solstice, set within a monument that's meant to be something to do with the passage of the sun. With his hands passing over the map, Gaffney showed how, on the longest days of the year, the pits formed a triangle with Stonehenge, marking sunrise and sunset. Nobody had ever seen these pits before, he continued, but they linked the area of Stonehenge with the cursus directly. Either these things have been put inside the cursus to mark these points, or the cursus has been wrapped around them. What's so interesting about the cursus pits was that they told a story about the landscape. The sunrise pit was visible from Stonehenge, but the sunset pit was not. It was nestled behind a ridge and could have been seen only if there had been a fire and smoke coming from it. At some point, the pits will have to be excavated for evidence of such activity. These discoveries fed into a larger understanding of Stonehenge as a diachronic, operating in light and dark, sunrise and sunset, day and night. The point I think we're coming to, said Gaffney, is that increasingly we can see the area around Stonehenge as providing extensive evidence for complex liturgical movement, which we can now understand, largely because we know where things are. Parker Pearson, for his part, takes a cautious view of the new research. Until you dig holes, you just don't know what you've got, he told me in his office at the University College in London. What date is it? How significant is this? There are extraordinary new features coming up, and we're thinking, well, what are they? To be sure, he said, the data from the Hidden Landscapes Project backs up the pattern we've already been seeing for some years. We have an excessive number of solstice-aligned monuments in that landscape. Nowhere in the rest of Europe comes even close. He added, this is fantastic stuff that's been done, and it's raised a whole series of new questions, he said. It's going to take years. The clouds shifted in front of the sun, dappling the landscape with shadow. Gaffney and I were walking the avenue, 300 yards or so from Stonehenge, and in the distance a string of barrows gleamed like opals. Although he acknowledged the fallibility of all archaeological projection, in the end, he said, we are all wrong. His work has led him to a new interpretation of how Stonehenge was used. Gaffney's idea was not to focus on Stonehenge itself, but on processionality, with the whole landscape. He imagined people moving around the area like Roman Catholics processing through the Stations of the Cross. He recalled an Easter Friday ritual he saw in Croatia, in which a bloke with a cross led fellow barefoot celebrants on a miles-long trip. In Gaffney's view, the building of the Great Stone Circle was a monumentalising of a similar if heathen procession. As he walked downhill through the fields, Gaffney stopped from time to point out the hillocks in which the illustrious dead were buried. He also noted how the avenue was not a straight line between the Avon and Stonehenge, but rather a series of tacks that brought the visitor to the Stonehenge site in a theatrical way, along the line of sunrise on the summer solstice. He thrust himself into the mind of a Bronze Age visitor to the site. "You will have seen nothing like it," he said. "It would have been massively impressive." Soon we descended into the valley called Stonehenge Bottom, only 100 yards or so from the great stones. "They're disappearing. Watch, just watch," he said. Within a few yards, the monument became invisible. When you picture Stonehenge in your mind's eye, you imagine the concentric rings of vast stones standing in an open, desolate landscape, visible for miles around. But now, here we are, a few 100 yards away, and the thing is gone. We stood in a field, watched by some lethargic cows, and savoured the strangeness of the moment. Then as we stepped uphill, Stonehenge re-emerged on the horizon. The lintels, then the great sarsens, then the smaller bluestones were suddenly before us. Gaffney's voice lifted. He spoke about the Jerusalem syndrome, the feeling of intense emotion experienced by pilgrims on their first sighting of the holy city. In the prehistoric world, there was no conception of God as he was understood by the later Abrahamic faiths. But, said Gaffney, as Stonehenge reappeared before us, whatever the ancient version of Jerusalem syndrome is, that's what you're feeling now. And if you visit the show notes and click on the link to this article, there are a number of photographs in a short slideshow showing Stonehenge from different angles and points of view. From the www.weirdus.com website, Lake Okeechobee's Watery Graves. Lake Okeechobee covers 730 square miles of South Florida and parts of 5 counties, making it the second largest body of fresh water within the borders of the United States. Prior to 1545, Calusa Indians called the Great Lake Miami, which is probably where Miami gets its name. In 1564, 2 shipwrecked Spanish sailors referred to it as Serape, while in other accounts it is identified as Lake Mayacoco or Laguna del Espiritu Santo. In recent history it has been known as Lake Okeechobee, a fitting Seminole word meaning big water. Lake Okeechobee has not been immune to strange stories or unusual claims, and it has had its share of tales about ghosts, lost treasures, and even monsters. In 1956, a pilot flying over the northern end of the lake reported seeing giant dinosaur tracks in the mud. Most of these weird accounts have been dismissed as just folk yarns. As for the dinosaur tracks, they turned out to be tracks left by dredging machines. However, Lake Okeechobee has one unexplained mystery, with good physical evidence, that has baffled both scientists and local folks for many years. It's the secret of the Okeechobee bones. Prior to 1910, early pioneers reported seeing human skeletons in the shallows of the southern end of the huge lake. Several old fishermen told of catching human skulls in their nets. One early settler claimed that there were so many skulls in the shallows that during low water it looked like a pumpkin patch. A surveyor clearing land on Grassy Island in the early 1900s exposed more than 50 human skeletons that were covered only with a couple of inches of sand. This was not a case of dry land burials, as Grassy Island is not a natural island. It was originally lake bottom that was exposed when water levels were lowered by drainage canals. Willis Crosby used to catch catfish in Okeechobee and shared his story with me about finding a half-dozen human skulls in 1953 just lying in the mud on Observation Island. There were a bunch of other bones scattered all over the bottom. I guess they were human, he recounted. Everybody said they were Indian bones. It was pretty much a common sight when the water was down. All accounts of finding human bones come from the area extending from Creamer Island to Observation Island and the several square miles in between the mainland. In 1918, the water level dropped to an all-time low, revealing hundreds of human remains wedged in the silt along the north sides of Ritter and Creamer Islands. There seemed to be no order to these skeletons. Bones of both adults and children were scattered all over the lake bottom. The first theory that comes to mind is that these were the victims of one of Okeechobee's terrible hurricanes. If so, then it would have been an ancient hurricane, because the 2,000 dead from the 1926 and 28 hurricanes were recovered and buried in mass graves on the mainland. Prior to 1900, only a few people lived around Lake Okeechobee, which would rule out any mass casualties from floods or storms, and certainly not enough to account for the estimated thousands of mysterious bodies on Okeechobee's bottom. Some researchers have looked to Seminole War for answers to this mystery. However, the only local skirmish was the 1837 Battle of Okeechobee on the north end of the lake, which resulted in only 30 dead. Historians have found no early Spanish connections to the mystery and believe that the bones may predate the first Spanish period by thousands of years. Some speculate the skeletons may have been residents of an ancient Indian village devastated by tribal warfare or disease. This would certainly account for the presence of both adult and children's remains. But if this is the case, then what explains the total absence of artefacts and pottery? In my conversations with anthropologists and historians, it seems that no one can really explain what the bones are doing in Lake Okeechobee, although some think it is a huge underwater burial site. Perhaps the big lake was seen as a spiritual place by some ancient culture and a good place to bury the dead. In 1997, I asked archaeologist Dr. Warren Browning about this possibility and learned that some Aboriginal burials were done underwater with the bodies anchored to the bottom of the lakes. Still, this does not explain why so much skeletal material is scattered over such a wide area in no apparent order, or why there are no artefacts associated with these bones. According to one legend, in February 1841, 200 Seminoles, rather than to be captured by the army, committed mass suicide. Allegedly, these people slit their own throats and flung themselves into the water, where their bodies disappeared into the glade's water. I don't know if this has any connection to the bones in the lake. Plus, I've found no historical records to support this story. However, the story goes on to say that a medicine man put a hex on the area, which has since been known as the Curse of the Everglades. A story appeared in a supermarket tabloid a few years ago that claimed the curse was responsible for two major aircraft crashes in the area: the 1972 TriStar Flight 401 tragedy and the 1996 Flight 592 crash. The Seminole tribe of Florida responded that the tabloid had tried to create a myth and that the story was Holash Cohen. If my Seminole translation is correct, I believe that means something like a bunch of hogwash. There have been many wild speculations about Lake Okeechobee skeletons. Maybe they are the remains of a mythical lost tribe, like mentioned in various religious chronicles. With the Florida Peninsula extending so far south into the ocean, it is reasonable to think that ancient seafarers must have bumped into it at some time. Perhaps the skeletons belong to refugees escaping from Atlantis or aliens from outer space. Until someone arrives with a good explanation for this ancient mystery of death, the secret will remain guarded by the big waters of Lake Okeechobee. There are many things that scare us. There's the fright we feel when our well-being is threatened. And there's the core chilling fear that comes when we confront the unknown or it confronts us. As we've seen in many stories, ghost and haunting phenomenon can unleash this fear. Then there are incidents that are just so strange, so far removed from everyday experience, that they can cause us to question our sanity and work their way into the pit of our deepest fears. Michael experienced such an incident while travelling the interstate from the Australian Capital Territory to New South Wales in Australia. This is Michael's story. From the paranormal.about.com website, by Stephen Wagner. Incident on the road to Sydney. There are two ways you can get from the Australian Capital Territory to Sydney in New South Wales: the fast way and the highway. The highway is bent around farmland that the government could not buy, so they built small roads around it instead, and the highway detours a minimum of 3 miles away from each farm. The fast way is a series of narrow roads that pass through beautiful countryside that is heavily forested, so forested that you can't see around bends. I took the fast way, of course. I was travelling along these roads at about 7 to 9 p.m. I didn't check much. The terrain alternates between forest and plains every 10 to 20 minutes, so I passed through forest, then plain, then forest, then plain, then forest. A journey through the fast track takes about 2 to 3 hours, depending on speed. Needless to say, I didn't mind the speed limits. Although I didn't keep track of time, I could have sworn I was travelling for far over 2 hours. I stopped for a rest. It was a beautiful night. The moon shone rather brightly, light dancing upon the trees, illuminating dust particles and highlighting a nearby pond. The gum trees around there are bone white and stood out starkly in the moonlight. If a bush or rock was in front of one, it was quite evident and made the tree look like it was floating on air. The moon seemed to get increasingly bright, which was very strange, as it was also very low. I decided to step away from my car and venture through the forest to find a clearing so I could get a better view of the moon. I walked through the dense forest and finally came to a field of crops. They must have been planted recently because the dirt had sharp depressions all over it of varying sizes and shapes. I suddenly remembered what I was there for and looked up, only to be shocked at the fact that the bright moon I sought was actually a spotlight. Half blinded, I looked down and raised my hand, instinctively to shade my eyes. A moment later my heart almost stopped. The spotlight switched off, and another was switched on, facing the opposite direction. I looked up, and as my eyes adjusted, I saw in the distance a scarecrow. It was, as far as I could tell, facing to my right. Then I swore I saw it move. Not violently, it just wobbled. In the wind, I said to myself, and there was a bit of wind. Just as I was about to turn and walk back to my car, I sneezed. It echoed across the field. I looked back up to see the scarecrow still standing there, to my relief. So I started off, back towards my car. I reached my car, put the keys in the ignition and started the engine. It's a Mitsubishi Magna Executive and is almost dead quiet on the inside. What happened next is rather hard to explain because it makes little logical sense, but I'll try. I took one last look towards the spotlight, which I could barely see through the trees before. I froze. There was no blinding spotlight, only the lit field, illuminated as if the spotlight were pointed straight at the ground. Most puzzling is that the dense thicket of trees I had walked through was gone. I could only see the field. At this point, I'm not even certain I was still in my car. I could not think of anything else. I was completely frozen, only able to take in the psychedelic vision that presented itself before me. The illuminated area started to grow smaller, then stopped. At the dead centre of the field was a man. He had a gun by his side. I remember feeling my hands, but every time I moved them, the man moved the gun closer to his head, as if preparing to shoot himself. So I froze again, not daring to see what would happen. Then I could feel my legs. They started to hurt. I didn't dare to move them either. Soon I could feel my whole body, but again I dared not move. I was not aware of the dimension of time at this point. I sat still, drawn into the view. I grew tired. My hands fluttered and the man's arm raised more, now pointing the gun straight at his head. He started crying. He was looking at me now, his other hand raised and pointed to his left. I was now aware of some cuts on his body, even though he was so far away. They seemed not to be old wounds, yet they did not bleed. "There!" he screamed. It was like he was right next to me. His voice was piercing like an air siren. I thought my heart would fail and felt like my chest was being sliced up from the inside. The gun fired and I raised my arms to my ears in a pathetic attempt to block the noise. The noise stopped and I looked up. I was in my car, and my car was in the field. In a daze I got out and saw tyre tracks leading from the road to my car. Had I fallen asleep? For some reason I was not at all frightened then. In fact, I didn't fully remember what happened until I was in Sydney hours later. Some days later I returned to that field in the daytime and looked around for the spot I would have been standing in during this dreamlike incident. When I found what I vaguely remembered resembled the view of the field, I looked in the direction the man had been pointing. In the distance I saw a house. Now I swear when I looked at that house I saw a man in the window. He wasn't the same man, but that didn't matter. He was upside down. That was all I needed to go speeding home at 1,000,000 miles an hour. I never took that road again. In fact, I never drove at night again. The music for today's podcast came from the musicalley.com. The bandwidth is provided by TalkShoe at www.talkshoe.com. The show notes are kept at the Origins podcast website, www.origins.info. And don't forget Origins is spelt with a Z, not an S. And I'd also like to thank these people for giving the podcast a donation to help with its ongoing costs. Thank you to Philip Hunsinger, Michael Ross, Ronald Klinensky, and Cameron Huff. Your help and support is greatly appreciated, everyone. And I'd just like to wish Amy Flood all the best with her upcoming operation. So Amy, keep well, keep safe, and I hope you recover swiftly. So until next time, everyone, this is Paul saying bye for now and keep well.